Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video, we're going to be doing a full build and review of the Airfix 176 scale Buffalo LVT. I'll be adding a couple of 3D printed parts to improve the details, as well as convert it to a American LVT-4 Amtrac. So without further ado, let's get into building this little vintage classic. To start with, I give all of the plastic and 3D printed parts a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any dirt or oil from them, before I then started cutting out the various hull parts using my Tamiya side cutters. Once cut out, I sanded away any of the flash or excess sprue from these parts. This kit has been around for quite some time, so there is a fair bit of flash, and the bottom of the hull especially required a fair bit of cleanup using a knife. As is typical for an older Airfix kit, the panel lines on the upper hull and driver's cab are all raised, so I decided to try using my Tamiya scribing tool to score them in. I probably should have been a bit softer and careful, as I did not achieve very straight panel lines and they were all a little bit too deep. Once done, I then carefully glued the very curved lower hull to the left side of the hull using some Revell Contactor Professional, followed by the engine and driver's cab bulkhead, and then the right hull side. The cargo compartment was then slid in, which fitted very easily, and before the sides fully dried, I then squeezed the ramp into place and did not glue it so that it could be moved. There is also a floor piece for the ramp with some raised lines, as well as some more side panels with what appears to be a compartment which contains the ramp's raising and lowering mechanisms. Next I added the hull roof, which also has the mudguards and driver's cab moulded into it. I did consider 3D printing an interior or even just some drivers to put into place, but decided to keep my upgrades limited to what is more visible on the outside. The side plates were cut out and cleaned up along with the top panels for the rear boxes, and then they were glued into place as well. In general, the hull assembly was pretty fiddly, but after being cleaned up, the parts fitted together pretty well, though this tooling definitely has a lot of flash, and the circular mounts for the ramp were incredibly thin and brittle, and sadly later on broke. To soften the rather overdone panel lines I'd scored, I decided to then run some Tamiya Extra Thin over them to soften the effect. The Extra Thin was also run over all of the part joints to help produce a stronger bond, and to fill in some of the gaps. Moving on to the slow and painful process of assembling the running gear, I cut out the wheels, sprockets and idler, and then assembled the idler halves. The idlers were then glued to the hull sides, followed by all of the main road wheels. An outer hull piece then locks all of the wheels into place, but before I added this part on, I decided to rescore the raised panel lines. Though now that I've looked at reference photos a bit more closely, I think it would have actually been better if I'd left them there to replicate the weld marks, as they look more accurate than the recessed ones I ended up adding. Once the panel lines had been scored, I glued the two return rollers to the top of the outer panels, assembled the sprocket and glued it to the hull, and then I finally glued the outer segments to the hull and wheels. A fair bit of fiddling was required to get them to line up, but in the end I managed to do it. The first set of resin tracks I made were slightly too small and fragile, so I had to redesign and print them out. In the meantime, I started adding the smaller accessories such as the bow gunner's mantlet, headlight covers, the hatches, and the kit's included tying points. Moving on to the resin parts, I clamped my benches with some bulldog clips to straighten them out, and in the meantime added the base pieces and arms for the 30 and 50 cal machine guns using some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue. The 30 cals were then slotted into the arms, and they fitted perfectly and can naturally pivot. However, the 50 cals would have required drilling part of the hull roof for them to slot in, so I ended up just gluing them into place. A spare resin 50 cal was used to replace the thick ugly plastic blob that's included for the kit's bow machine gun. Since in reality the benches were foldable, they only had some very fine framework connecting them to the hull, which would have been very fragile. So instead I decided to glue some spare bits of sprue to the bottom of the benches, and then glue those to the hull where they wouldn't be visible. The ramp was really loose fitting to the rather fragile holes that hold them into place, so I tried applying some CA glue into them to make the fit a bit tighter, which worked for a bit, but unfortunately they still later broke apart. The kit had quite a few small gaps which I had to fill in with some Vallejo water-based putty, and I also took the chance to fill some of the worst of the scribing panels which I'd done too deeply, or any of the scratches I'd added by mistake. Some vague plastic bumps were moulded to the hull for the grab handles, but I ended up replacing these with resin ones. For this build, I experimented with using some Mr. Primer 1500 mixed with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner to thin it down, and then dabbing this in several thin coats using a brush onto the model to create some armour texturing. This would create some faint imperfections and dimples that are common in armour, and would also make this vehicle's large flat areas look a bit more interesting. To my knowledge, the LVTs were made entirely of rolled armour plate or metal sheets, so unlike a cast assembly, these imperfections would be very subtle and probably not really visible at 1/72nd scale in reality, but hey, this was a lot of fun, and I do not think it looks too different from the actual vehicles. By this time, my second attempt at the resin trucks had been printed out and cleaned up, and this time they fitted a lot better, but still needed a few small repairs. I then added the last of my extra details, such as the vision slits onto the cab that are absent in this kit, along with some missing hooks and handles, the rear convoy lights, framework near the ramp, and I also replaced the hollow cylinders on the mudguard since the kit ones were just nubs of sharp plastic. And with all of these additional resin parts added, the kit was ready for some priming. I went with some Vallejo Gloss Black Primer mixed with roughly 50% acrylic flow improver to 50% primer to make airbrushing it on a lot easier. I gradually built the primer up in many thin passes, aiming to keep it slightly wet looking but not too runny, until eventually the whole kit was a shiny uniform black. Once the upper surface was primed, I then repeated this process on the underside, and set the model aside for a full 24 hours to allow the primer to cure before painting. With the primer cured, I began painting the olive drab scheme, first with a base coat of, well, Vallejo Model Color US olive drab. This was thinned down with 8 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver and 5 drops of Vallejo acrylic thinners to 8 drops of paint. Things nearly went disastrous almost immediately when I had some water get into the airline and spray water all over the model. Water in my airbrush has been a constant issue I've faced in the hot and humid Queensland weather, and it hasn't helped that my first compressor I've been using didn't have a tank, so even though I had 2 water traps, they would still fill up within minutes of painting. Recently though, I switched to a new compressor that has a tank, and no longer have these issues. I found the model colour paint was alright to spray on after adding a few more drops of flow improver, though I still experienced a fair bit of tip drying. However, this could also be a result of, once again, my lack of a tank attached to my compressor at the time, meaning that the air pressure on my airbrush would gradually lower when I was running it for longer periods. Eventually, I got the first coat pretty uniform onto the model, and followed this up with a second layer. For the underside, I decided to not paint the very bottom of the hull, but instead have the olive paint fade away to replicate the effect of shadows under the vehicle. The acrylic paints dry very quickly, so once my airbrush had been cleaned up, I moved on to attempting some highlights on the upper surface by mixing some of the US olive drab with the slightly lighter Vallejo 71015. This mix was sprayed onto the upper surface of the vehicles as well as onto the sides to add some lighter shades of olive drab on panels. I found the effect was too subtle, so I then added a drop of 71305 cockpit green and again sprayed this on the upper surface and different panels to create highlights and panel variation. I wanted further contrast and more fading on the upper surface to give the impression my Amtrac had been well used, So I added a few drops of the even paler Model Air 71132 Imperial Japanese Navy Pale Grey, and this time mainly sprayed the upper surface and the middle of some panels for some faded areas and lighting. The colours were still a bit too dark for my liking, so I added a few drops of interior green to this mix, and this time I was a lot happier with the more pale shading in random spots, especially on the ramp walkway and around the hatches where paint would be weathered from people walking. In some reference photos, LVTs appear to have different shades of green on their side panels, so to replicate this and also give the impression that my vehicle had had a few parts replaced and repainted to prevent too much corrosion, I mixed various colours such as British dark green with the olive drab to paint different panels with subtly different shades. RLM66 was also mixed in with the olive drab to produce some deeper shading on the sprocket, lower hull and inside the cargo area. The effects were honestly very subtle, and I probably should have made the contrast even heavier since, as you'll see, the varnishing and later weathering really toned it down. And with the olive drab finished, I started painting the machine guns using a few thin base coats of model colour flat black and a fine brush. This was then followed by some Vallejo Model Air No. 41 US olive drab for their ammunition boxes, Vallejo Model Air Gunmetal Metallic for their barrels to give them a metallic shine, US olive drab for their framework to match the hull, and some Vallejo Model Colour Flat Earth for the machine gun handles. Finally, I then painted the ammunition belts with Model Colour Gold, and picked out the straps on the machine gun's ammo boxes with some Vallejo Model Colour Buff. Unlike many Shermans, there did not appear to be any rubber used on the tracks, so I painted them entirely with a few coats of Vallejo Model Colour Natural Steel. With most of the painting now done, I sprayed the model with several light coats of Vallejo acrylic gloss varnish mixed to a ratio of 50% acrylic flow improver to 50% varnish. The glossy coat would seal the paint job, protecting it from getting scratched or damaged when handling the model, and also provide a smooth surface to apply the decals onto to prevent silvering. The varnish was left to cure for 12 hours, and then I applied the kit's included star decals without any of the British specific markings. The decals were placed in some warm water for a few seconds, and once they became loose of the paper, I applied a bit of water onto the model where the decal would go, and then slid the decal into place using my brush and carefully positioned them. Once on, they received some Vallejo decal softener gently rubbed on, followed by some Tamiya decal adhesive to help them sink onto the model. Being new cartograph decals, they behaved really well, and once they'd had 12 hours to set to the model, I then sealed the decals and gave the model a duller finish by applying several coats of Vallejo acrylic satin varnish. I went with the satin varnish since a lot of much more professional armour modelers use it to get a metallic sheen on the model that generally looks a bit more realistic. But in this case, I probably should have gone for a matte varnish instead to have a dull and more faded look for the camouflage, which would have also better contrasted with the weathering effects I would later be applying. But on the whole, I was still pretty happy with the effect, and the fading and colour variations, though a lot more subtle now, were still present, and I was happy with them for a first attempt. The model would once again be set aside for 12 hours to let the varnish cure, before I could then move on to the weathering. In keeping with experimenting, I decided to try a chipping technique I've seen both Night Shift and Plasmo use for their armoured vehicles, which first involves adding a light layer of chips. These are usually a lighter colour than the camouflage, which in this case would be some Vallejo Model Colour Flat White mixed with Model Colour US Olive Drab. I then dry brushed this paint onto the edges and sharp corners of the hull, very heavily on the hull roof, floor and ramp where there would be a lot of foot traffic and exposure to the harsh Pacific sun, and also some random scratches along the side of the hull. I really liked how this technique looked, especially on the upper hull in terms of creating a faded paint effect, and it was reasonably easy to do. My advice would be to make sure you're careful and apply the paint sparingly, and also make sure that you wipe off most of the wet paint from your brush onto some paper towel, so that when you dab it onto the model, it doesn't produce any soft edges or too much of a build-up. While the lighter coloured chips dried, I added some paint chips to all of the white markings by dabbing on some US Olive Drab. The next stage for this chipping technique would be to then go over these lighter chips with some Vallejo Model Colour Old Rust. This darker colour has a very nice rusty chipped paint sort of look to it, and when applied carefully, the lighter base colour makes it pop and gives an illusion of depth to the chipping. It's a bit tricky to see on the model using the camera, but in real life when you see it, it really pops. For this, I found that making sure that the paint was dry when dabbing it onto the model, and applying it sparingly so that each rust chip was still surrounded by some of the lighter paint made the effect a lot better. I was really happy with the more rusty look to the chips on this model, but for some fresher metal chipping, I decided to also apply some Vallejo Model Air aluminium. I kept the chipping limited to just parts of the front mudguard and ramp, as well as in the hull walkway. This colour was also used to paint the rear convoy lights, and to dry brush the track cleats. Once the acrylic paints had dried, which didn't take too long, I then got out some Tamiya Black Panel Ascent, Tamiya X20 enamel thinners, and some AK Interactive Light Rust and Dark Rust for some enamel weathering. I first used the Black Panel Ascent by running it over the machine guns, recessed details on the driver's cab, and onto the hull roof to highlight the recessed details and add some depth. The excess panel wash would then be gently removed with a cotton bud which had been dipped in enamel thinners. This dried pretty quickly, so I then moved on to adding some rust streak and effects to give the impression that this LVT had been used heavily and exposed to the sea, air and water in the Pacific. For this, I first used a brush and dabbed on some of the AK Dark Rust deposits. I applied it sparingly over some of the chipped areas, and then used a fine brush dipped in enamel thinners to streak it downwards and soften the effect. I repeated this process a few times around the entire vehicle, also applying it at the base of all of the grab handles, along the ramp and the floor. This colour was quite dark and uniform, so I added some streaking with the much lighter AK Interactive Light Rust wash. If I applied it too heavily in any areas, I then removed the excess with enamel thinners, which was also used to once again blend and streak these colours. I continued adding a few streaks and marks with both the Dark Rust and Light Rush on the hull, and then I mixed up some of the Dark Rust with enamel thinners to produce a rust wash, which I then applied onto the tracks to add a build-up in their hinges. Once this was done, I gave the model a day or two for the enamel effects to fully dry. For this build, I decided to try modelling my LVT as though it had just exited the water and was driving onto a sandy beach to drop off a load of Marines, so for reference I used scenes from HBO's fantastic series The Pacific. Even if the weathering on the LVTs in this series may have been done artificially, it still looks very convincing, and the way that the sand and water interacted with these vehicles was real. So based on that, I used some fine sawdust and AK gravel and sand fixer to apply a build-up of fine texture in between the tracks and the top of the sponsons where it seems to build up. This effect can also be seen in photos and seems to have been particularly common with the British Buffaloes, although of course that would have been mud given they were in the European theatre. I built up a few layers of the sawdust, dusting off the excess, and then I left it to dry for about a day. Obviously the sawdust was way too dark to be sand, so I had to then paint it with some Vallejo model colour Iraqi sand. I also streaked this colour down the sides and thinned it heavily with water to add some fine particles of sand falling down the sides of the hull. I don't usually use acrylic paints for weathering, but I found it pretty easy to use the water to thin down the edges and also add a bit of feathering, and once the acrylic paints had dried, it produced a really nice subtle washed out and sandy effect. As I painted and weathered the model, I found that some of the fragile grab handles fell off, but fortunately I made a couple of spares with the 3D printer, so it was super easy to just glue replacements on and paint them up later. The sawdust required a second coat of Iraqi sand to make it a little bit lighter and more solid, and I also used it to add some dry brush scratches and chips onto the wooden benches inside of the hull, and to add a light build-up of sand on the floor. Unfortunately, despite multiple attempts at repairs, the ramp continuously fell apart, as the fine hoops that were supposed to lock them into place were very fragile and poorly moulded. I attempted gluing them back together a few times, and also replacing them with a spare handle, but nothing really worked that was solid, so I may have to at some point replace them with some finer wire or something else so that I can still open and close the ramp like I wish for some animations. After all of the replaced handles had been painted a few coats of olive drab, I then sealed in all of the enamel washes, the chipping and the sand effects with a very thin coat of Vallejo Model Air semi-gloss varnish. I allowed the varnish to cure for 24 hours before then trying out some AK Interactive wet effects for the first time. This enamel product was applied using a large pointy brush, and I did it in various patterns such as streaking down the sides of the hull, as well as dabbing it onto the edges of panel lines where water would sit and slowly dry from, in a flicking and stippling pattern on the sides of the hull for some splash effects, and I also built up several layers heavily on top of the sponsons, on the underside of the hull, the tracks, and the floor of the troop carrying compartment. For a first attempt, I was pretty happy with the effect that this created, although I'm sure there are probably better ways to apply it a little bit more realistically. Once it was applied, I then gave it a few hours to fully dry before I finally painted the 3D printed convoy lights with some Tamiya X27 clear red. And with that, I decided to call my Airfix LVT-4 Amtrac conversion finally completed. And here you can see the final result. So it's been quite a while since I last did an armoured kit, and despite the Airfix kit showing its age and the quality being a bit lacking in some areas, especially for the ramp's attachment points, I still had quite a lot of fun building this one. Upgrading this kit with the extra vision ports, handles, rear lights and details, the American machine guns, and replacing the tracks made a big difference, and I'm very happy with how these details improved the kit. Of course, it also comes with a Willys Jeep, but frankly it looked a little bit meh to me with the wheels and general details, so I'm not too sure what I'm going to end up doing with that one just yet. I think overall I did alright with weathering and painting this model. It was all a bit of an experiment to try different approaches to chipping using the old rust and lighter camo colour instead of just aluminium, and I quite like how that turned out. I rarely weather my tanks with much more than some basic dirt and mud in the tracks, so trying for a specific appearance with the rust, sand and water was a bit of a challenge, but I quite enjoyed doing it. Of course though, it being the first time I've tried this, I would definitely love to hear other people's thoughts on how they'd go about adding some of these effects. Even though this is a basic and old kit, and the fact that it's in 1/76 scale instead of the now much more standard 1/72 scale, there doesn't appear to be too many better alternatives for LVTs in this range, apart from a kit by Dragon, which apparently is for a post-World War II vehicle and has its own issues from what I've heard. So if you want an LVT, this does seem to be one of the only real options, at least for now. My upgrades are available for purchase on my Colts page, so if you have one of these kits and want to upgrade and convert it from the British Buffalo, you can also do so. At some point though in the future, I will be designing my own full 1/72 scale kit for this vehicle, along with some Marines to crew it, and maybe also some of those wacky fire support vehicles they made using its chassis. But it may be quite some time before I get around to doing that. So while it's not a great kit by modern standards, it's still not a bad one to put together, and I'm sure for many people it holds a lot of nostalgia. It can also still be upgraded with scratch building or 3D printing, and although I'm probably not going to build this one again, I am looking forward to using this kit I've made in a stop motion at some point in the future. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future videos. And if you have any advice or any comments that you want to leave, feel free to put them down in the comments below. A massive shout out to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only buying these kits, but also the products I use to make them and the time I spend making these videos. Part 1 of my build of the Airfix Bristol Bowfighter just came out, and I'll also be doing part 2 very soon. And as for the next armour build, I'm going to be doing one really soon on the T-34 I've designed and 3D printed myself. That's it for now, but until the next video, as always, take care and model on.